An organisation that fights for the protection of media professionals has condemned attacks that were directed at journalists who were covering the opposition rally in Zimbabwe yesterday. Some were manhandled and physically harassed when the riot police allegedly dispersed the crowd that was waiting for the Citizens of Coalition for Change leader, who you just saw there, Nelson Chamisa. Let's talk more about this, and we're joined via Zoom by Committee for the Protection of Journalists Africa Programme Coordinator Angela Quintal. Angela, good evening to you and welcome. Quite serious reports of assault and obstructing journalists from doing their jobs. Share more details around what happened.
Sure. Hello to you and, of course, to your viewers. Yes, yesterday, 4 journalists were on their way to cover a rally. There's a by-election in the area. And we're watching a convoy of ruling party supporters trying to stop or to blockade a road. So that obviously supporters of the opposition couldn't attend the rally. And in the process took photographs and some video footage and were set upon allegedly by ruling party youths, supporters who assaulted them, beat them up, kicked them. All the journalists were injured. They also stole their recording equipment, their cameras, as well as removed the car keys. And this is something that we find particularly egregious simply because it obviously sends a signal that it's open season for journalists, particularly as you see that there will be an election next year, and we're just seeing more and more problems and violations against journalists.
As you say, you know, it's one thing to declare open season on journalists, and it's another for journalists to be able to have recourse to the police or to facilities that can protect their rights. What's your sense of contexts like this, not only in Zimbabwe, but in other countries where that fail-safe and that protection does not exist for journalists?
It certainly doesn't exist for journalists in many countries on our continent, unfortunately. And in Zimbabwe in particular, we certainly do see impunity when it comes, for crimes against journalists. And we've seen a pattern where the police will not investigate, or will then turn their interest on the journalists themselves, and suddenly you actually have journalists then being accused of some other misdemeanor and then being arrested instead of the real culprits. And so we've seen this pattern. We saw it over the COVID period, but as we had it with the by-elections and as we've seen with this by-election that's coming up and obviously with next year's elections, we are seeing a pattern where journalists are getting it from all sides. So while you're seeing journalists being assaulted, you're also seeing journalists being arrested and charged from, false news charges, some for insulting the president. Many of them are then detained and then released, and the charge then continues to hang over their head, which is a great strategy to ensure that you effectively censor journalists, because obviously if this is what's happening to them, they are unlikely to try and rock the boat, so to speak. So it is a form of censorship that we're seeing, and the Committee to Protect Journalists obviously remains pretty worried.
And any kind of censorship, of course, and gagging does not augur well and bode well for democracy or for the transparency of major events like elections. Angela, do you think that media organizations on the continent are doing enough to protect their journalists?
I think that one can never do enough. And I think that media organizations have a range of problems, from just trying to survive in these economic times. But also, many of the journalists that you see now are freelancers. So when we talk about media organizations, it's not as though they have media outlets who are there to protect them. And so this is where the Committee to Protect Journalists comes in, because at the end of the day, we're seeing many journalists are now freelance journalists, and they're the ones who are at the coalface, and they're the ones that are bearing the brunt of the violations. So organizations like CPJ and others who are working in this sphere are trying to fill that gap, obviously.
I want to go back to the question, Angela, in politically tense environments such as the ones that we were describing in the earlier part of our conversation, what are some of the things, and obviously territories that have histories of violence against journalists. How can journalists carry out their jobs? I mean, you know, it's on the one hand, as you say, organizations can only go so far and they're cash-strapped. And you have, I mean, journalism is the kind of profession where we're always running towards things happening, whether or not we have the support or not, whether we have the support or not. So what would some of the advice and best practice be in these really unusual, tense and dangerous environments?
So I'm now sitting on the other side, you know, I'm I'm no longer sending journalists into the fire, right? I'm trying to ensure that journalists actually are protected. And I think the one thing that we do need to ensure is that journalists themselves have the sort of safety training that is necessary. And I think that too often people will simply go on assignment without thinking things through. And I think it is really important for journalists to be aware of their surroundings and to have the basics when it comes to ensuring that they're protected. I mean, I can say to people now, there's no need to be a hero. A dead journalist is not going to help anyone. It's not worth dying for a story. And unfortunately, we are still seeing that. But I think that there are many organizations, and I'm happy to see, certainly in South Africa, where there is an understanding that journalists need to have that sort of skill, that they need to get the sort of training that is important, that they can protect themselves, but not only physically. I think another thing that it's great to see that is happening back home, of course, is the fact that when it comes to trauma and how journalists are being affected with the work that they do, that there is there's a lot of attention now on the trauma that journalists face and ensuring that journalists get the sort of help that they need. That there's nothing to be ashamed of. And I think that has been one of the big strides that really needs to be, that everyone involved needs to be congratulated on, that they have realized that this is a huge, huge problem and they're facing it and they're doing something about it.
A very important conversation we've just had. Angela, thank you very much for talking to us. And as you say, you know, it doesn't serve anyone if you're not around to be able to tell those stories. So certainly we have to take better care of ourselves and journalists who are actively working in the field. Angela Quintal is the CPJ Africa Program Coordinator.